Okay, well, it is 12:30, so we're going to go ahead and get started with this panel. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for Forest of Hope, Mined Land Reforestation in Appalachia. Kenton Sena of the University of Kentucky will be our convener and panelist, and he'll introduce the other speakers, but I just want to tell everyone that this is part of a series of sessions that are running this conference. They were designed for the 2020 conference about that focused on the mother forest, and it was called Appalachian Understories, Building Hope and Resilience from Commonwealth to Global Commons, and a series of forest sessions focused on the mother forest, the Appalachian Commons forest, was designed as part of that. Some of those have made it into this conference in this virtual form, and I'm really delighted about that. And this is the third of those sessions. We have 3 more. All the special sessions in the program are forest-themed sessions. So I want to invite everyone to consider joining us for the remaining 3 as well. The first 2 have been wonderful, and I'm sure this one will be. And with no further ado, I'll hand it over to Kenton.
Awesome, thank you, Kathy. And so I just wanted to quickly introduce this panel, so Forests of Hope, Mined Land Reforestation in Appalachia. The forests of Appalachia are some of the most biodiverse temperate forests of the world, but have been threatened over time by unchecked resource extraction, poor management, climate change, and harmful introduced species. One of the most impactful drivers of forest change has been surface mining for coal, which has impacted vast tracts of formerly forested land. For over 1 million acres, this impact is almost permanent, with reclaimed mine lands persisting as novel ecosystems dominated by non-native grasses and shrubs. However, in recent years, reforestation of active mine sites has become more commonplace, and researchers continue to make headway in restoring forests on mine land formerly reclaimed to novel grasslands. This session will highlight mined land reforestation around the region, focusing on stories of restoration success. And our first panelist is Dr. Jennifer Franklin from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. Dr. Franklin is a professor in the Department of Forestry, Wildlife, and Fisheries at the University of Tennessee. She studies the effects of the environmental stresses on tree growth and function, and teaches tree biology and forest restoration. She completed her PhD at the University of Alberta in 2002, studying tree physiology on reclaimed oil sands, and has continued to work in the mine reclamation research. She has been a member of the Appalachian Regional Reforestation Initiative Science Team since 2005. She is currently the co-chair of that science team. So without further ado, Dr. Franklin.
Thank you, Dr. Sena. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
The presentation? Okay, perfect. Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel and for having the opportunity to kind of introduce this topic. So what I'm going to talk about today is the Appalachian Regional Reforestation Initiative, just to give you a little bit of background for the following talks. So a little bit of history. Prior to 1977, reclamation practices varied widely between states and regions. So some states required reforestation or some sort of reclamation, while other states really had no reclamation requirements or enforcement. But across the region, there was widespread water quality issues primarily, so a lot of environmental issues. So in 1977, the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act was passed, and the main reason for that was to reduce those water quality impacts of coal mining. So along with that came the establishment of the Federal Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation and Enforcement to help enforce that. And there are also the state agencies that they work closely with. So it was now required to reclaim coal mines after they were finished mining. And the mining industry developed a series of methods that were pretty successful in reducing those water quality impacts. They graded the soil so it was pretty flat, but it was also pretty compacted. And they planted really fast-growing vegetation. Mostly this was non-native because it's pretty easy to get established, and a lot of non-native pasture grasses and legumes. So this became standard practice across the region. And I say it was pretty effective at reducing the water quality impacts. But then around 2000, about 20 years or so ago, people noticed that these lands were not returning to what was the pre-mined vegetation that was our native hardwood forests. Instead, we still had those non-native grasses and legumes and some kind of shrubby areas. So they weren't undergoing natural succession in a way that they should. So we use the term arrested succession to describe those. So around this time, a couple of the folks from the Office of Surface Mining, this is Patrick Angel, who's a soil scientist from Kentucky, and Victor Davis, who's a forester from Tennessee. They had been looking at some restoration research, and they also looked at some mines on which forests had established naturally, years before that 1977 Act came into play. And they saw some really great productive forests. So it was clear that good forests could get established on reclaimed mine sites. And they became determined to follow up on this. And the question was, how to do that. So there was already some research going, but they knew that they were going to have to get a lot of different people involved. So they founded the Appalachian Regional Reforestation Initiative to get information out and get people working together for a common goal. They knew that we needed to have the academics, the researchers, to figure out why tree planting was working in some cases and not in other cases. We needed to have the state and federal regulatory agencies to help promote tree planting to the industry. And we also had to have the industry willing to take a risk, to go a little bit outside what they normally do and take a risk to plant trees. Then, of course, the public is so important to support these efforts because it is a change in what had been standard reclamation practice. So everybody came together with a common goal of planting more high-valued hardwood trees and getting some natural hardwood forests reestablished, because these forests are the future livelihood of the community. They're so economically important. So together they started the Appalachian Regional Reforestation Initiative. The core team was made up of regulatory agencies in the Appalachian coal mining states, both state and federal agencies. That was in 2004. And then in 2005, the science team joined with some researchers that had been working on mine reclamation, some for years, and it really snowballed from there. So the regulatory agencies from the Midwest and some of the southern states joined as well. And we now have members of the science team that are from 18 universities, several nonprofit organizations, and number of state and federal agencies as well. So there have been a lot of people working on this, all working together. So the first task of the team then was to develop a method that could be used across the region that would allow trees to get reestablished on a mine site. So talked to the researchers, and the science team came up with the forestry reclamation approach. There are 5 steps to this. The first is to create a suitable rooting medium for good tree growth. There are some soils that trees just don't grow very well in. So the idea is to find the best material in terms of texture and chemistry and make sure that goes back on the top. Second is to loosely grade the topsoil. So we know that really compacting the soil and grading it too much was preventing those roots from getting established. The trees just weren't doing well. So the idea is to get that top layer of material to be fairly loose. Then to use ground covers that are compatible with growing trees. We do have to plant something along with the trees because we need some immediate erosion control. So some vegetation has to get established quickly. But we don't want it to compete with the trees. So the idea is to use species that aren't going to be persistent and that won't prevent the trees from getting going. Then to plant 2 types of trees. So we want early successional species. Wildlife is really important on this site to promote wildlife habitat, early successional habitat. So we have some tree species for that, but we also want to plant those commercially valuable crop trees like oaks. And some of those won't establish on their own because they have really large seeds that don't move that distance. So we do need to plant those. And finally, make sure we use proper tree planting techniques that ensures good establishment and growth of the trees. So after this methodology was developed, it had to be communicated to a wide group of people. And to make sure that everyone had access to it, and that everybody could read it. All the way from, we needed mine operators to look at this, and also citizens' environmental groups. So it had to be accessible and understandable. So these are very non-technical, they're easy to read, they're usually 3 to 6 pages. Reclamation advisories, they're available free online. And the first few covered those basic steps, those 5 steps that I just talked about. And then it's expanded from there. So the science team continues to produce these reclamation advisories. And more recent ones cover related topics like exotic species control, pollinator habitat, and riparian vegetation. So the group has an annual meeting. So we haven't had one past year or so, but we'll return in 2022. And the main purpose for that is to get all that new information out to folks. So all the researchers will present their latest information, their latest findings to industry and to the regulatory agencies. But the other thing that's so important about that meeting is that industry and the regulatory agencies will tell us as researchers what's working and what's not working, and what problems they're having or questions they have. And that allows the researchers to go back and address those issues. So it's a really nice meeting that allows information to go both ways. So important. There's an Excellence in Reforestation Award that's awarded to industry partners that go above and beyond in terms of reforesting their sites. We have a number of demonstration sites that we take the field trips to in the annual meetings, and also some workshops go out to those. There are a lot of community outreach events. Most states have an Arbor Day event, and taking high school or elementary school children out to help plant trees on mine sites. And then, because this method is not just applicable to reclaimed coal mines, but to a lot of other cases like municipal sites. So the speakers go out into the community and talk to municipalities about how to reforest areas, and even go out and spread this methodology to the rest of the country and to the world. So it's a great active group. So have to thank our current core team leader, Chris Miller, and Michael French, who is my science team co-leader. And it's through a whole bunch of people who've put in a lot of effort over about the past 15 years that we're now really well on our way to returning these former coal mines to really productive forests. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Sena.
You're welcome.
And so without too much time in between, we're going to move on to the next talk, and we will have time for questions at the end. And our next speaker is Dr. Rebecca Swab. And Dr. Swab is an Ohio native who attended Ohio State University, where she received bachelor's and master's degrees. She went on to complete her PhD at the University of California, Riverside, where she studied how plants respond to stressors such as changing fire intervals and climate change. Rebecca was the director of restoration ecology at the Wilds from 2015 to 2020, and I'll let her update us on her current appointment, her current position. She has experience in restoration of a wide variety of ecosystems, including prairies, forests, and wetlands. And it has experience both with prairie establishment and maintenance through prescribed burns, invasive removal, and supplemental seeding. And I believe she's talking with us today about a project exploring forest health on a site that was reclaimed prior to SMACRA in 1977. So if you can have that in mind when you're thinking, that's kind of the context from Jennifer's talk. So without further ado, Dr. Swab.
Hi, can you all see my slides and see me?
Yes.
Okay, it's different than Zoom, I'm not used to this. Thanks for the introduction, Kenton, and thanks, Jennifer, for the first presentation, which helps set the stage. Yeah, so as Kenton mentioned, I recently started a new position as conservation manager for Grange Insurance Audubon Center, which is part of Audubon in Columbus, Ohio. So today I'm going to talk about our forest healthy after mining, and as Kenton mentioned, I'm focusing on a different aspect than Jennifer did. And I have Jennifer listed on this presentation because at the end of this I'll get to where there's a group of us that are going into look into this question a little bit deeper. So Jennifer already kind of gave you a bit of a background of mining, but when surface mining for coal, this is a photo of what surface mining for coal looks like from like the 40s or so. Actually, then it might be more like the 70s, that everything is removed off and it looks like the surface of the moon. And it's done it depends on the equipment in particular areas. But in the place I worked at the Wilds, there was this large dragline operation. This was the biggest dragline on Earth during its operation. And the place I worked at the Wilds actually, incidentally, after reclamation on the grassland areas, put rhinos and other exotic species, but I'm not going to talk about those today. And Jennifer already gave a little bit of background about this too, but there's different kind of eras in the history of mining. In Ohio in particular, there was actually an era that was called, it was a law, it was a permit, it was called the tree law from 1965 to 1972, where they actually required planting trees. And then once there was like an Ohio SMACRA, and then the SMACRA was planted, and once those laws passed, so 1972 and on, most of the reclamation was into grasslands like Jennifer was talking about. But I'm going to focus instead on this tree law era when in Ohio trees were required to be planted. And in a lot of the other Appalachian states, there were different types of tree laws passed at slightly different times. It was not a national law, it was just like from state to state. But by the time that SMACRA was passed, most trees had some states had some sort of a tree law going. Yeah, so by the time that SMACA was passed, permanent and effective vegetation as tree cover was the rule rather than the exception across the Appalachian region. So when I was at the Wilds, I saw these forests, and I saw that they looked very successfully. There were lots of trees there, but I wondered, how exactly do these mined forests compare to areas or forests that weren't mined, specifically looking at productivity, function, health, diversity, composition, and regeneration. So this was a study that I did with a collaborator from Denison University, and this used MODIS information, which is a satellite. Essentially, it gives an idea of productivity, and you see these little kind of rainbows here and a bunch of overlapping lines. And basically what this shows, some of these are sites that were reclaimed at different times, and then there's a reference forest. And you can't see a difference between them because basically the productivity was the same between all of the forests, which is great news. It means that our reclaimed mined forests in terms of productivity were equal to our reference forests. So that answers the first question of productivity and function. How do mined forests compare to unmined forests? Looking at the NDVI, so our vegetation output is equal. So that's a smiley face. We're happy about that. That's good. There's other studies that have shown that there can be similar density and lumber production off of some of these mined forests as unmined forests as well. So to look at health, we used a metric called a rapid upland forest assessment method. And basically you walk a transect through a forest and you count different things. So you might count flowers, like native herbs, you count, laying down, woody debris, standing and laying down snags and logs. You count the number of different types of species you find, and you look at the shrubs you find and whether they're native shrubs. And you get points for each positive metric that you meet. And this was developed by Holden Arboretum, and some of this work was done in collaboration with those folks. And so when we compared the forests at the Wild, so we had reference unmined forests, and then we had forests that were kind of disturbed, that had been agricultural land but not mined, and then compared mined. And so you can see that this RUFA score, the higher the score, the more metrics were met. So the healthier they are, definitely a difference between the mined and the reference. So our mined forests aren't meeting all of these benchmarks as the reference forests, not at least in that time frame. In particular, some of the metrics they didn't meet in particular, we're looking at some of that fallen debris, coarse woody debris, snags, and they tended to have higher invasive cover and not enough large trees. So for that, we say they are not as good. So we have a thumbs down for that particular metric. So then looking at diversity across the forest, this compares a variety of different forests on the Wilds, and the blue are the remnant, the unmined, the orange and the red are different types of mined forests, and the green is coniferous. So you can see that there's a variety of different diversities, and what's more, when we look at what we would want diversity for these forest species to be, this is in unmined forests, it was in this range here. So you can see that some of our sites met these metrics and some of them didn't in both the remnant and the mined forests. But one of the things we did notice when we looked at composition in particular is that we found a lot of ash trees. Some sites in particular had a lot of ash trees. More ash trees definitely in the mined than the unmined, which will be relevant in a little bit. And this was because ash was planted pretty heavily during these reforestation. Here's a quote that white ash in particular was recommended on leveled or unleveled sites with alkaline or acidic mine soils. It grew well on mine soils. So overall, for composition, we found high amounts of invasive species. So this is a comparison photo of, this is an unmined forest. You can see a pretty clear understory. And in the bottom photo, you can barely see the interns doing the study through the dense invasive shrubs. And this is partially because autumn olive was often planted at these reclamation sites. Because it also grew very well, as invasive species often do. It was recommended. One study found that autumn olive can dominate up to 75% of the vegetative cover of these mined sites. So overall, when we look at diversity and composition, there was a similar canopy diversity for our mine sites as for the unmined, but there was different composition. We found more ash and more invasives in the understory. So overall, I'm going to give that one also a thumbs down. When we looked at regeneration, again, this is a variety of different sites across, and the orange and the red are the mined sites. The blue is the remnant comparison, and this is the number of seedlings. And so you can see that some sites didn't have very many seedlings at all, but some of those sites were in the unmined areas as well as the mined areas. And if we look in particular, a lot of those were ash as well. So a lot of the ash were regenerating quite well, or maybe regenerating because of their stressors. And when we look at the diversity index of the seedlings, this is the same sites. So you can look at the diversity, and you can see that in general, the remnant sites have a higher diversity, and there's some quite low diversity for some of these mined sites. And again, comparing to unmined areas, what we would want seedling tree recruitment to be, it's kind of in this range. So if you look across the board, you can see that 1, maybe 2 of these mined sites meet that range, but all of the remnant sites do meet that range in terms of the diversity of seedlings is what we want our target to be. So for regeneration, there was lower diversity and many ash in our reclaimed mine sites. So again, I'm going to give that a thumbs down. So overall, kind of our threats to these mine forests, I mentioned ash a few times. Probably many of you are familiar with the emerald ash borer that has swept across our forest and taken out many ash trees. So that's definitely a threat to these reclaimed mine forests. Climate change, of course, is a threat as well. Climate change can change the distribution of species. So some of these species that were planted that did well in reclaimed mine sites might have perfect habitat suitability now, but might lose it in the future. So we might be losing some of those sites from some of those species from our sites. And then, of course, invasive species. They're there, they're present, and they might be able to take advantage of some of these losses of these other species due to pests or climate change. So overall, when I picture kind of the forest, here's my theoretical reclaimed mineland forest that right now looks like a decent forest. It has a decent kind of composition and productivity. But my concern, and I know this is called Forests of Hope, and this is going the opposite direction, but I'll get to the hope in the end, is that, so the emerald ash borer comes along and eats all of our ash trees, so we lose those. And then climate change comes along and knocks out another species, so we lose that. And then those invasive little happy shrubs there that are waiting in the understory can grow and take advantage of the increase in sunlight. And my concern is that these reclaimed mineland forests will turn from forests into invasive shrublands with interspersed trees instead. But here's where the hope part comes in. We aren't at the point yet that we need to get Doctor Who to go in the TARDIS and go back in time in order to prevent this from happening. We are at the point right now where I think we can still prevent this from happening. I had a project in the wilds that I don't have time to talk about today where I did invasive species removal and plantings in the understories in order to prevent this. So I think we can prevent this reality from occurring. So in conclusion, our reclaimed forests, I think, are at risk due to these different threats. So we need to better document issues, which is what Jennifer and my other collaborators that are listed on this are in the process of doing. We're looking at U.S. Forest Service data and reclaimed mine sites and reference sites across Ohio, and then we're planning to expand to across the Appalachian region to figure out, are these problems that I've noted in a small scale, or are they occurring at a larger scale? Is this something we really need to focus on? And then we can look for solutions now. So as I mentioned, I did some restoration efforts at that particular site. Again, invasive species removal, understory canopy plantings, and we can look at how that goes with time and see if that's an effective solution to these. All right, and so I want to thank the following funders that helped with various different aspects of this work, and the collaborators for the project that we were just starting.
Awesome, thank you, Rebecca. And so again, we'll have some time at the end for questions, and looking forward to that conversation. I am next in our panel, so I'll go ahead and just quickly introduce myself. I am while I also pull up my slides, I am a lecturer in the Lewis Honors College at the University of Kentucky, and I am talking today about creative solutions to complex ecological challenges, lessons from an experimental loblolly pine plantation in Kentucky. So I am excited to follow up the two talks that we've already had from Jennifer and from Rebecca. I think that I'll be able to join into the conversation with them pretty well. And also point ahead to Sarah's upcoming talk. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and jump right in and just acknowledge at the front end my co-authors Josh and Brandon, who are former students in the Lewis Honors College, Beth, who is a student intern at the time of the data collection from this project, who did that work, and then Chris Barton, also at the University of Kentucky, who supervised this project. So as we've already talked about, and this is with respect to Jennifer's presentation earlier about kind of the legal framework of surface mine reclamation in Appalachia. I'll be talking about post-SMACRA sites in this talk. So these are sites that were reclaimed after 1977, and they were reclaimed, as Jennifer was describing, with those high compaction techniques that led to really heavily compacted soils. Those soils were also not necessarily constructed out of the best available geological material, and so oftentimes they're chemically unfavorable to tree growth as well. In addition to that, as Jennifer mentioned, revegetation of mine sites under SMACRA privileged the use of highly competitive species, many of which were non-native, and that led to the formation of highly competitive non-native grassland systems, and kind of the synthesis of these two different factors, these unfavorable soil conditions and these highly competitive vegetation, the use of this highly competitive vegetation led to these grassland sites that, as Jennifer mentioned, are considered in arrested natural succession. So they're not on their own recovering to the forests that would be typical prior to mining on these sites. So there's some work that needs to be done to get these so-called legacy sites that are in these non-native grassland systems transitioned to forest. So you first have to address the soil compaction problems. And we know that you can effectively address soil compaction problems on those sites by ripping, tilling, or disking. There's also a need to address the soil chemistry conditions. So if soil chemistry is unfavorable to native tree growth, you have to do some kind of amendment to address those conditions to improve that favorability. There is also obviously a need to address the vegetative competition. So taking care of those competitive non-native species that can outcompete native species. And to some extent, the jury is still out on what are the most effective mechanisms for doing that. And then I'm really appreciative that Rebecca talked about climate change, because I think that is a conversation that underlies all of this when we were talking about restoration work anywhere, but maybe especially in the Central Appalachian region. Climate change is a really significant underlying and overarching kind of ecological change that's really affecting the long-term future of these sites. So I'll just quickly introduce this project. This project was set up to look at to compare the use of a few different soil amendments for effectiveness in mineland reforestation. So they used compost, fertilizer, compost plus fertilizer, and then no amendment. That was one kind of set of treatments. They also tested inoculating seedlings with mycorrhizae versus not inoculating seedlings with mycorrhizae. And mycorrhizae are fungi that interact symbiotically with the roots of trees to improve nutrient and water uptake. So they're considered useful in these sorts of harsh spaces because they can help to theoretically help to improve tree survival and growth. And then the next question was to compare two different species of trees, so to look at loblolly pine and northern red oak and see if either one of them is more a better fit or performs differently on these sites. And I should say, loblolly pine is not common or native to Kentucky. It is sometimes planted in Kentucky, but it's not considered a native species here. And red oak is, and it's considered an important species in our forests. But under climate change projections, red oak will become less important in Kentucky over time, and loblolly pine is likely to shift its distribution north into Kentucky over time. So some interesting potential future forests under climate change projections. So after 3 years, Chris Barton published a paper that reported that mycorrhizal inoculation improved loblolly pine growth, did not significantly affect red oak growth. And then fertilizer and or compost improved loblolly pine growth, but also didn't affect red oak. So those are some of our preliminary findings. These soil amendments and mycorrhizal inoculation was maybe beneficial for loblolly, but not for red oak. So we went back to these sites in 2014 and surveyed them again. So this was 10 years after planting. And those surveys included clipping all the biomass, all the vegetation in the understory in 1 by 1 meter grids. Also measuring the height and diameter of 25 trees per plot, and then tallying all of the trees that were still alive to estimate the percent survival. So we've got understory herbaceous material to kind of get a sense of that vegetative competition. And then we have both height and diameter, as well as survival to get a sense of tree growth and survival, or to test the difference in performance of those different species. And so the differences over time between these two species are really significant. On the x-axis, I just have the different surveys at different time points. So they were planted in 2004, surveyed for the first 3 years after that, and then surveyed again in 2014 after 10 years. And you can see a pretty dramatic difference in height growth between loblolly pine and northern red oak. The loblolly pine, just for your reference, is the darker gray bar, and the red oak is the lighter gray bar. You can see average height of loblolly pine after 10 years exceeding 7 meters, and then average height of the northern red oak not even quite to 2 meters. So really significant difference in height over time between those species. And interestingly, no significant effect of soil amendments after 10 years. So while the soil amendments, compost and or fertilizer seem to improve loblolly growth and survival after 3 years, that effect had washed out by 10 years. And just noticing the differences in survival, you can see while both loblolly pine and red oak survived approximately the same through the first couple years after planting, by 3 years and continuing through 10 years, loblolly pine was demonstrating significantly higher survival than red oak. I think this is my last kind of data slide. The one other effect that we found interesting was the soil amendments. So soil amendments after 10 years didn't seem to have an effect on the growth or survival of either red oak or loblolly pine. However, there was this effect of compost and or fertilizer on vegetative biomass. So that when we went into the understory and clipped all the material that was in the understory, there was higher biomass in the plots with compost and or fertilizer than, with the compost or compost plus fertilizer than there were in the plots that didn't have any soil amendment. So an interesting effect of compost that seems to persist long term. Oops, I'm sorry. And then I'll just quickly also point out in our 10-year sample, we noticed a pretty significant difference in vegetative biomass under loblolly pine plots than northern red oak plots. So there was just significantly less of that competitive vegetation under loblolly plots after 10 years. So really interesting results there. And I just wanted to show a couple of site photos to kind of give you an idea of what we're dealing with. This one on the top is an overview aerial image of these plots. The squares that are green are the loblolly pine plots, and then in between is where the red oak were planted. Those are the red oak plots. You can just very readily see there's a strong difference in survival and height growth. You can see it from above, pretty significant. I'll also point out these silver dots all throughout these plots are autumn olive, which Rebecca mentioned in her presentation, and I'll get back to in just a little bit. On these lower photos, this is my co-author Beth Hansen, showing the great height growth on the loblolly pine plots, as well as the poor understory, sparse understory vegetation under the loblolly plots. And then in contrast, this is one of the red oak plots. She's standing next to a red oak tree right here. And you can see an abundant understory vegetation there that can be really competitive. And all this in the foreground is Sericia lespedeza, which is a non-native, highly competitive shrub species that's common in these sites. So some quick points, concluding points. It's clear that loblolly pine quickly and dramatically outgrew northern red oak on these sites. And it's clear that the competitive vegetation was significantly reduced under loblolly plots compared to northern red oak plots, and that seems to be a shade effect. And so I think a really interesting option, and this is why I use the term creative solutions. I suggest that I think it's a really interesting possibility to use loblolly pine plantations as kind of a nurse tree on these sites, because they were really effective at reducing vegetative competition. And on other sites where we've just planted red oak, in this study, for example, those native hardwood species weren't very competitive and didn't survive or grow very well in those harsh and competitive systems. So is it possible, is it a good idea perhaps to set up a loblolly pine plantation on a surface mine site, on these legacy mine sites, as kind of a first step just to get the invasive species reduced, and then go back and do some thinning and underplanting with hardwood species that would be typical of a mature native forest in that region? It's a possibility, so something to think about. And I should comment, we have, after this survey, I think 1 or 2 years ago, we had a group from UNC come up and set up an experimental system within this set of plots, where they thinned the loblolly pine plots and underplanted with some native oak species. And so we'll go back over these next couple years and survey those growing oaks to see what their survival and their growth looks like, and see if that nurse crop idea could possibly work. So many thanks to folks who helped set this up and collected the data and helped to write and analyze, as well as our funding sources. And we will take questions at the end. So let me unshare my screen. Great. And without further ado, I will go ahead and move right into our next presentation. So next we have Dr. Sara Klopf from Virginia Tech. Sara received a BS from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in integrative biology and an MS in plant biology from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, where she studied peatland reclamation after oil sands mining in northern Alberta. She has since worked as a research associate at Virginia Tech, where she's managed ecological research projects covering myriad topics, including coal mine reforestation, coal spoil and refuse, leachate, water quality, mineral sands, mine revegetation, wetland rehabilitation, and American chestnut restoration. She's also served as a mentor to both undergraduate and graduate students and volunteered both time and sweat equity on various restoration and ecological monitoring projects for multiple state agencies and local NGOs. When she's not working, she's discovering new hikes with her husband in Roanoke, Virginia, and also a recent new addition to the families.
Yep.
And today, Sara will be chatting with us about using the forestry reclamation approach to restore American chestnut on surface mines. So very much looking forward to your talk.
All right. Thanks very much, Kenton. Can you see my slides? Is that popping up okay?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, great. Thanks for inviting me. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about some work we did, as Kenton said, using the forestry reclamation approach for American chestnut restoration. And I'll focus on the long-term effects of initial seed mixes. The American chestnut was a former giant in the forests of Appalachia. Historically, it represented about 1 out of every 4 trees, and it had a range of close to 1 million square kilometers. As you can see in this picture here, the tree was huge, and so it was dubbed the Sequoia of the East. It had both ecological and economic value due to its consistent large mass of chestnuts, and because the tree grew so straight and tall and was branch-free for the first 50 feet, and also due to its extreme rot resistance, it was used from the cradle to the grave. Unfortunately, a fungal blight was detected at the Bronx Zoo, which was introduced and rapidly spread by the Japanese giant cultivar. And essentially what this disease does is it creates these fungal cankers that damage the vascular tissues and prevent water and nutrients from getting to the canopy of the tree. And so the tree dies back, but it will continue to re-sprout from its roots in a kind of a multi-stem shrub, but never really reaching a very large size, because by the time it gets about 5 centimeters in diameter, it will contract additional cankers and die back. And so the American chestnut is functionally extinct in the majority of the forest. Chinese chestnuts are somewhat blight resistant though, and so the American Chestnut Foundation began a backcross breeding program in the 1980s to introduce blight resistance from these Chinese chestnuts. And the general principle is that after this initial cross between an American and Chinese chestnut, they backcross with Americans, and in each successive generation, they increase the proportion of American chestnut DNA in the genome. So there's some promise in these hybrid trees, but they need to be field tested to know how they'll perform in real world settings. So this map on the left, you can see this is the original, or the native range of the American chestnut. And on the right, this is a map showing active coal mines from the CDC in 2015. So to date, over 1 million hectares of native forests have been impacted by coal mining. And so you can see there's quite a bit of overlap between the ranges of the American chestnut and these coal mines in Appalachia, which really gives us a unique opportunity to field test these new chestnuts in land already in need of reforestation. So Jennifer already introduced the FRA and the forestry reclamation approach, so I won't go over this in detail, but I'm going to focus today on the effects of step number 3, and with that, I'll start introducing our project. So our overall goals were to quantify the survival, growth, and blight incidence of chestnuts after 9 growing seasons on an FRA reclaimed coal mine. And so this is a Google Earth map of Virginia, and here is our study site in southwestern Virginia in Wise County. The little pin says the Powell River Project, and that's actually a research site. It's a former coal mine that we have been doing reclamation research at for I think, about 30 or 40 years now. And here is a closer image of our site. And so I've got both of our two study blocks listed here, or shown here. And here's a closer image of our two study blocks. Both of these blocks were loose graded and seeded in the winter of 2007 and 2008. Block 1 is primarily weathered and unweathered sandstones and has a slightly acidic pH, and Block 2 is primarily unweathered sandstones, siltstones, and shales and has a slightly basic pH. 3 seed mixes: an annual rye seed mix, a conventional seed mix, which was that mix of aggressive non-native grasses and legumes that, that Jennifer also mentioned earlier, and then a tree-compatible seed mix that's typically a lower seeding rate and less competitive species like white clovers. After seeding, a mix of native trees were professionally planted as bare root seedlings and included a mix of crop trees, which were a number of different oak species, as well as wildlife trees that would grow a little more quickly, such as white pines and redbuds. Following March, a mix of chestnuts from the American Chestnut Foundation were planted as nuts among the planted tree seedlings, and this included a mix of pure Americans, pure Chinese, as well as 3 different hybrids that had different proportions of American chestnut DNA in their genomes. After planting, tree tubes were installed and labeled with the genotypes, and then after germination, unique tree tags were added so that we could track the success of individual trees. In the fall of 2016 through the spring of 2017, we returned to the site to record data on the survival, growth, and blight incidence of the trees, or all the trees that we could find anyway, and as well as a number of site characteristics. And today I'll focus on survival, height, blight incidence, and how those things were affected by our seeding treatments, as well as vegetation competition. So we quantified blight incidence using an index from Tizato et al. 2012. And this is essentially a range from 0 to 5 that you would record for the trunk, the lower crown, the middle crown, the upper crown, and for the tree overall, where a 0 would indicate no visible symptoms were present, and a 5 would indicate that visible symptoms were present on 81% or more of the tree or tree part. To quantify vegetation competition, we used an index from Evans et al. 2013, and this was a rank from 1 to 5, where 1 would indicate no vegetation was present, and 5 would indicate that the vegetation was taller than the tree. So I'll just dive right into our results. So here we have survival on the y-axis and our 5 different genotypes. You can see that the Chinese chestnuts had much higher survival than any of our hybrids or the American chestnuts. Survival in our 2 blocks was similar and was about 44% after the 9 growing seasons. Here we have tree height and our 5 genotypes, and you can see our tallest trees were Chinese chestnuts, our shortest trees were the pure American chestnuts, and then our hybrids were kind of in the middle. Looking at survival and our 3 seeding treatments, you can see that the annual rye seeding treatment had the highest survival, and the conventional seeding treatment had the lowest survival. Among our seeding treatments, the tree-compatible seeding treatment had the tallest trees compared to our 2 other seeding treatments. Trunk blight also differed among our seeding treatments, and we found that blight was more severe, trunk blight was more severe in the tree-compatible seeding treatment compared to the conventional seeding treatment. Looking at our vegetation competition and how that affected tree height, you can see here that our shortest trees were in where the vegetation was the most aggressive, and these 3 vegetation competition classes did not differ. We also found that total blight severity, and this is for the tree overall, when it's compared to the vegetation competition index, we saw a steady decrease in blight severity as vegetation competition increased. And so just to quickly summarize, in terms of genotype, the Chinese chestnut simply survived and grew better, and we didn't observe any differences in blight among genotypes. And this is kind of what we would expect, because Chinese chestnuts, based on the literature, seem to do well on sandy and gravelly soils, and also seem to be pretty well suited for mine soils, probably for that reason. Looking at our seeding treatments and vegetation competition, we found that survival was highest in the annual rye seeding treatment, and that trees were taller where vegetation was less competitive. We also found that blight severity was greater where vegetation competition was lower. So overall, what we found was that with better execution of the forestry reclamation approach, meaning less aggressive vegetation, we had higher survival and growth, but we also found that there was more blight. And a possible explanation for this is that where the trees are growing better, we have higher stem density and therefore faster disease transmission. It's also possible that where the trees are growing better, they're larger and just simply maybe more likely to show blight symptoms. But in any case, what is clear is that our seeding treatments can have long-term effects on the success of a reclamation. Because we are seeing because we are seeing this severe blight, that suggests to us that we might need greater blight resistance for trees on these mine lands to compensate for a greater probability of pathogen spread. And yeah, with that, I think we're done with our panel, or our presentations. But I'd like to thank all these funders.
Awesome, thank you, Sara, and thank you to all of our panelists. And so appreciative of all the cool work that y'all are doing, and I'm excited to continue this conversation. So I did notice there were a few questions in the chat. Kathy, do you want to kind of moderate questions, or I can?
Either way, Kenton, if you want to do it, I'm happy to just stand by.
Awesome. So yeah, we'll just address the questions in the chat real quick, and then any other questions. I think we have until 1:45. So James asked if the dominant land use after mine restoration is aimed at timbering operations. It makes sense to take advantage of a highly disturbed environment to redisturb in the future. Just wanted to hear everyone's thoughts on this. I'll just comment from my understanding of the forestry reclamation approach. Timber, like high value timber species, are kind of a key component of that species selection process. I think ultimately it depends on kind of the landowners or mine operators kind of desired post-mining land use. So I think there is some variability depending on that. But Sara, Rebecca, do you want to comment on that question?
I think that the reason that you're planting a mix of species and a mix of species, especially that have different growth rates and different functionalities, I think that's, yes, timber is important, but I think there's also a big emphasis on helping other natives, insects and other critters and things along the way. So it's not just about timber, it's about creating healthy forests that can be economically valuable.
Yeah, so I agree that a lot of the original intent from what I've read was kind of focused on timbering, but that ecological health in general, the shift is kind of focused. I think now more ecological health in general is the focus. So some of the articles, I think in like the 60s and 70s, and some of the things I talked about were focusing on biomass for harvesting and things like that. But I think that the focus has shifted a bit. And I don't know about other states, but in Ohio, I haven't seen a lot of timbering actually happening on the reclaimed mine land. And I think some of that could just be because of logistical difficulties. There tends to be a lot of like high walls and other things that would prevent machinery from getting back in there. So even if the biomass is there, it's logistically difficult to access. And of course, it's up to the individual landowners.
Great, and let me just also kind of try to summarize. There's a few other questions. So from Mary and Kate and Kathy, if I can synthesize your question, it's related to James's question about kind of post-mining land use, I think, and it's really interested in exploring. So the question, if we had to reduce them to one question, what is the interest or the awareness or the kind of current and future possible work related to exploring non-timber species of interest, plant species of interest, maybe especially in these reclaimed forests? And so, for example, Mary was asking about engaging community stakeholders in planning restoration, related to the sorts of provisioning that might take place in pre-mining forests. Kate asked about native herbaceous and shrub plants, that especially those that have value as non-timber forest products. So any thoughts on that, Sarah, Rebecca?
Yeah, so I guess first of all, like I love both these questions, and I think this is one of the advantages of having kind of like this cross-platform kind of conversations going on, that like I feel like scientists tend to get really focused on the science behind things and kind of forget about some of the other aspects. So I would say that I feel like there has not been much engagement of stakeholders in terms of what is being planted. The stakeholders maybe are kind of just considered to be the landowners, which in some cases is the government, which then it would be accessible by the general public, but I don't think that there is that much engagement of stakeholders, and there should be more. And that is something that maybe we should consider adding to like the science team and the other team is something to talk about for sure. We make the recommendations, but those are really kind of coming from us and going to people rather than a back and forth process. So thank you for that comment. In terms of non-timber species, again, I feel like that is something that isn't focused on as much as it should be. That is something that it is here and there. So like my project that I didn't have time to get into, that's one of the things that I focused on was understory species, herbaceous and shrubs, and looked at some of those things. And so like there's a PhD student who's looking at ginseng and I'm bringing the other, but a couple of again, potentially useful forest products, and planting those on reclaimed mine land and figuring out if they're successful in reclaimed mine land, which they were not super successful. They would survive, but the populations were kind of shrinking, unfortunately. So I'd say that there is some, but it's kind of here and there. It's hit or miss, and it just depends on like individual people's focus rather than being a kind of a comprehensive plan from my experience.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But there's also, I would just make a comment that there's kind of a limitation on what you can get established. It's a lot of these mine lands, you end up kind of having soil chemistry and soil textures that are really, it's a real challenge to actually get native species established. Essentially, a lot of times you don't end up with a lot of topsoil left. And so it's very difficult to get some of these maybe rare, valuable, sensitive species to grow.
And I'll jump off that comment. I think I was going to also comment related to both of what you all have said already. I think part of the challenge is that these sites start in such a novel kind of forest system. Like if you want to recruit native understory species, you have to have an overstory, like a thriving and successful overstory that's contributing organic matter to the soil and building a healthy soil. Like Sara, pointed out that our soils on these sites are not actually that robust. So you have, like, in order to have a nice, native understory herb layer and so on, you need like good understory soil and moisture conditions, and you need shade. And it takes some time for those kinds of conditions to develop on these sites. So that's part of the challenge. But I think related to what both Rebecca and Sara said, I think that's a really great question and a great direction for further research on these sites, because now, we're getting to the place where we have sites that are 10 to 20 years old, forestry reclaimed sites that are 10 to 20 years old, where we do have canopy. We are starting to see accumulation of litter in the understory and some of those other kinds of characteristics that might be able to support some of these desirable species. So I think that's a great next direction, and I'm making a note of that. And I think it would be awesome to have some continued conversations about how to build that into a cool, I think that could be a competitive multi-state research project, interdisciplinary research project. So let's keep thinking about that. Next, I'm seeing Kathy asked a related question about biomass in the presentation that I addressed, and we did not partition that biomass into invasive versus native. The majority of the understory vegetation that was present in both of those plots was invasive, though, so it was predominantly invasive in both plots, but significantly less in the Lob Valley plot. I'm seeing Mary asked another question about mine permits and how. So does documentation that appears in mining permits play a role in post-mining restoration? I think the short answer is yes. Sara or Rebecca, do either of you want to tackle that conversation?
I guess I would actually sort of say no. So I guess I have a different perspective. So I guess I feel like it's very loose and flexible. Like the law just requires there to be, I mean, I have a whole presentation on it, but basically the law just requires there to be what I call green things growing on the ground. And it only requires documentation for about either 3 years after reclamation, or once enough green things are growing on the ground, and then the government kind of walks away, and then it's up to the landowner after that. So that's why I'm saying I think the answer is no, because I feel like it's just too short of a time frame. What is oversight by the permit itself?
And that's a really good point. So I think to that at that scale, certainly, like, there isn't like a diversity requirement and so on. And I don't know that correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know that there is a native species requirement either.
No, they say native species can be used.
Cool. Great. The other thing that I would say with respect to that is I think that, permits do kind of steer post-mining restoration at the very coarse scale, where it can be reclaimed as wildlife habitat, which is kind of the non-native grassland kind of system. It's kind of considered wildlife habitat, and there are certain kinds of permit requirements for designating that as successful. And then I think if you reclaim it as forest, there are other permit requirements that you have to meet to be successful at having it reclaimed as forest. And then I think the other thing that I would say, it's not as much of an issue in Appalachia because of our steep slopes, but in other places, reclamation to crops require you have to reach certain kinds of productivity metrics to have it designated as successfully reclaimed. So I think at that scale, kind of the permitting process does kind of steer how that restoration is done. But for sure, 100%, there's not, like, from an ecological perspective or a cultural perspective, there's no regulatory structure that pushes it towards a healthy, thriving, diverse ecosystem. So. A question from Emma for Sara about how chestnut blight spread to forestry reclamation approach plots.
So the chestnut blight, it's spread through fungal spores, and they spread through usually wind, as far as I know. But the tricky part is that oak trees can function as hosts. They don't get sick, but they function as hosts, and so it kind of can facilitate the spread of the blight. And so even if you were to cut down all the chestnuts, it's still going to be there. It's everywhere. So does that answer your question? Hopefully. I guess you can't really answer me, but
And I think one other point, Betty comments that the pine might not be compatible with certain kinds of native forests. And I think that's a really important point that I wanted to quickly follow back up on. And that is that I don't think that loblolly pine plantations are a good way to go with respect to like long-term reforestation on Appalachian mine sites, because pre-mining Appalachian forests are not, pine monocultures. I'm only thinking about those loblolly pine systems as like almost like a vegetative control tool and a soil rehabilitation tool to kind of get those sites started in a direction where we can maybe transition them to a more diverse native forest. Just given the some of the difficulty that we see in restoring native forests on those sites at the beginning because of that strong invasive species competition. I didn't really make that point as clearly as I maybe thought I did in my head. So. And then I'm seeing another question about wildlife species being attracted to reclaimed forest areas, which might help spread or inhibit native understory plants, and specifically wood thrush, deer, turkeys, etc. Anyone want to comment on that?
I guess I'm not as up on the wildlife aspect of things. I mean, I know that there are a lot of wildlife in the reclaimed forests, especially deer. There's lots of deer. I think they might be one of the things actually keeping the trees from regenerating, because if they are regenerating, I think with these like difficult soil conditions to grow, the seedlings are growing a lot slower than usual. And so then there's even more of a chance, like if it takes them 10 years to get above the point that deer would be able to eat them, then they're more likely to be eaten by deer. So yeah, so I think that deer are definitely a problem. I don't know about other wildlife though.
I think it probably depends on where you are, but yeah, for sure. And I agree, Rebecca, that in my experience, limited experience, that deer can be more of a negative factor because they do inhibit tree growth, especially these like smaller trees, saplings. They're like little treats for the deer, spread out through the kind of the site, and the deer just come along and munch on them. So that's really significant. Elk are also a problem in eastern Kentucky, and probably around the region. We have a large elk herd that was restored a number of years ago, and so elk are a significant problem. I have also not personally done wildlife surveys, but I did find a turkey nest on one of my plots, one of my experimental plots a number of years ago. And there are other folks on the area science team who are working to address questions about wildlife, recruiting wildlife to these sites and improving wildlife diversity on these sites. We are, I think, out of time. I don't want to keep us any longer, and I also don't know what the restrictions are as far as whether you can stay in the session and chat longer. So thank you all so much. I'll just take, I'll kind of officially close this. Thank you so much to our panelists, Sara and Rebecca and Jennifer, who had to step out, unfortunately, for a class. So thankful for all of you and your work, and so thankful for all of you who attended, and hopeful to continue the conversations.